Hello and welcome back once again to a very special video because today, for the first Patreon request in quite some time, I'm going to talk about an artist who I've always wanted to discuss on this channel, but I never figured out a way to really dive into. And that artist is, of course, Roy Wood. Roy Wood is one of those artists who is both very complex and deceptively simple all at once. But I think the best way to describe him, who had never knowingly heard anything of his, would be like this. See, when the Electric Light Orchestra started, there were two main guys. It wasn't just Jeff Lynne being like, how many cellos can I add to this Beatles song? There was another guy. And Roy Wood was that other guy. And within that metaphor, if we were to describe solo Roy Wood, and to a slightly lesser extent Wizard, perhaps greater extent because of how weird that first Wizard album is, anyway, doesn't really matter. If Jeff Lynne is McCartney, then Roy Wood is Lennon, at least in the sort of stereotypical, vaguely wrong, because McCartney was actually, in a lot of ways, consistently weirder than Lennon, even if he never got quite as out there as Revolution 9, but you get what I'm saying. Anyway, it's a very tortured and reductive take. Some people are not going to be happy with me for using that metaphor, but I feel like it's the best way to introduce Roy Wood to somebody who knows nothing about him. Anyway, before all of that, Roy Wood was the mastermind of a group called The Move, who I understand were quite successful in the UK at the time, and all of their albums and singles are actually quite good and very worth your time. However, they had a lot of bad luck involving, amongst other things, losing a libel suit to the then sitting Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And because of that, they really don't have the kind of exposure that you would think that they would have, especially when you consider that they were connected to something that got as big as ELO did. Speaking of which, Roy Wood was in ELO for the first album and I believe part of the second album. After that, he went solo. He released an album, Boulders, 1973, very, very strong album. He was in a group called Wizard, which a very strange group, very interesting. Maybe I'll talk about Wizard Brew someday. And then we get to the album that I'm finally going to actually start talking about, 1975's Mustard. This is, well, I'll put it to you this way. If I had my choice, and if I was going to do like a Roy Wood series, like I did for Bob Dylan, I'm not sure this is the one I would reach for first. I think I would probably have started with The Move, and then Boulders, and then maybe Wizard Brew, and tried to sort of ease into, Roy Wood, because this is a very, very strong album. A very conscious attempt, I think, to make a big album, or at least that's how it sounds. I would say the three main points of reference for this album, which should be familiar to anybody who has watched my videos for any length of time, are Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys, Initiation by Todd Rundgren, and Confessions of a Pop Group by the Style Council. Of those three, Pet Sounds is the one that Mustard sounds the most like, whilst Confessions of a Pop Group is, I think, what it probably is the most similar to in terms of its style and overall function, in being, someone who is very eclectic, who draws from a lot of sources, putting all of that to use and making something that is monumental in its ambition and its production, if not necessarily in its song lengths or pretensions to a sort of universal astral sort of consciousness in the way that a lot of the, grand and over-the-top music I talk about in this channel is. It's not like Initiation, where it's going off on 35-minute synth interludes on Eastern spirituality. That's not something Mustard is about. Mustard is about, Andrew's Sisters, 40s pastiche, Brian Wilson-y stuff, wonderfully eccentric things that could have only come out in the 70s. See, originally I was going to have a bit here about how this is sort of the deep end of his work, maybe you shouldn't jump in here, but, I talked to the people who I've been conferring with for a lot of the background details on Roy Wood that I wouldn't necessarily have for this review, and they didn't really agree with that. See, I thought that Superactive Wizzo Band would be like the deep end for Roy Wood. They seemed to think his 1980s synth pop album and some of his weirder collaborations in later years would actually hold that distinction. Roy Wood is one of those artists who bridges a gap in the types of pop music nerd, but I have run out of time in the intro, so I'm actually not going to say anything further. About that, so let's get into the tracks. The album opens with the title track, a very well done 40s pastiche of the sort of jazz pop, and more specifically the jazz pop advertisements of the period. It's suitably lo-fi, catchy, and it would not sound out of place playing in the background in a period piece set during that particular time period. It's interesting too because there's a couple of 40s pastiches on this album, which originally I was going to say was a Roy Wood trope, but then I thought about it for a minute and realized I don't think it actually is. 50s pastiches are, and that's something I'll bring up here because he doesn't do as many of them on this album as some of his other albums, particularly the second Wizard album. Roy Wood loves 50s rock, but it's not just any 50s rock. It's that specific kind of homegrown stuff they have in the UK because Colonel Tom wouldn't let Elvis tour outside of the US. And also just because, it was easier for a kid in the Midlands to be listening to Cliff Richard and the Shadows than it was to be listening to Little Richard or Fats Domino or Jerry Lee Lewis or any of the other sort of original American 50s rock and rollers. Track 2 is perhaps the best song on the album, extremely catchy, and I love the production. It's a kind of Baroque-ish 70s pop thing, but the drums are produced excellently. It's always been something I admire very much about Roy Wood. He's one of the only late 60s, early 70s men who recorded and mixed drums well. While in general the 70s are a quantum leap in terms of at least rock-based stuff over the 60s in terms of record production. The drums are the one thing that the early 70s didn't do so well. It's very often you get a very thin drum sound of that era, and then it's really not until you get into that end 70s sort of 80s.5 phase around 76, 77, 78 that the drums, in my opinion, really start sounding great. But Roy Wood, that was consistently something he was very good at, and this track is an excellent example of it. Something I didn't mention in the intro. This album was a flop, and for the most part, I can sort of see why. Although it's still, you look at something like Wizard Brew, how that made it to 29, I do not know, even though, obviously Wizard's hits were a thing at the time. But by the same token, you'd think this would chart higher, especially because this track is so good. The Rain Came Down on Everything begins with a brief choral intro before transitioning into a bombastic, relatively slow ballad that is just pouring on the majesty like there was no tomorrow. This kind of ballad is the kind of thing that I'm not always into. And that's probably the biggest point of disagreement between myself and the two people who I have been drawing most of my information on this album from. They regard this as perhaps the finest example ever composed to magnetic tape of this type of thing. I myself, this kind of ballad, they're hard for me to evaluate, but this one I do think is a very good example of it, and I do enjoy it. Anyway, after 3 or so minutes, you get a very good instrumental interlude, which then transitions into a reprise of the original song bit of the piece, before we get a cool Pet Sounds-ish closing thing that ends a very solid track 3. This is an absolutely fascinating track, and if not this is an absolutely fascinating track, and if not necessarily my favorite thing on the album, it is, in some respects, the album's centerpiece, if only because it is such a statement of what Roy Wood in the 70s is about, which is to say, taking all of this very disparate stuff that he likes and throwing it all together into a blender. This track opens up with some interesting synthy sci-fi noises before springing into a bluesy track with Andrews Sisters-esque 40s girl vocal group vocals, which are all Roy Wood, by the way. I don't know exactly what he's doing to his vocals, but I believe it's all him. Anyway, after several minutes of that fascinating stuff, we get a transition into a more, I would say a more natural voice, but it still sounds like it's being sort of pitched down a bit. And then you get another transition into a sort of glam blues with slight funkiness to it, and a pitched up but non-Andrews Sisters vocal for the rest of the song. It's good stuff with some nice keys. Reminds me just a little bit of America Eats Its Young or Cosmic Slop era Funkadelic. But honestly, I'm not sure whether that's true or whether I just was thinking about Funkadelic when I wrote my notes. Either could be the case. I've mentioned Pet Sounds and the Beach Boys a lot in this video, and this is not going to be the last time either, but this is probably the most Brian Wilson circa 1966 track on this entire album, and it's a phenomenal short pop song with a wonderful vocal breakdown in the middle. It's just a really, really good song, solidly constructed, and especially impressive considering that it's all Roy Wood. The song is yet another majestic ballad, really laying on the pomp and the grandeur, although it's much more melancholy in character than the other big ballad on the album. It goes on for about 2.5 minutes before culminating in a majestic, angelic moment and then transitioning into a lengthy instrumental piece in which Roy Wood plays everything that seems to be inspired primarily by Romantic era funeral marches. Initially, when I was writing the script for this review, or at least the sort of loose skeleton of what I was going to say, I had thought, because Roy Wood did this on a Move album, that maybe this was something he didn't write, that it was, you know, sort of public domain classical music from that era. But apparently it's not. Apparently this is an original composition, and I have to say, you know, it's pretty good. I'm not enough of a classical guy to know, like, an incredible composition from one that is merely...
Boy, I really hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
The Eyes of a Fool is a fun, glammy pop song incorporating a lot of early 60s influences into a glammy whole that draws liberally from the Beach Boys, but also the brill-building pop of the era, and of course, the modern production techniques of the circa 1974-75 era. All of which is an unnecessarily verbose way of saying that I like the song, but at this point in the album I really don't know what to say about it. And so the album ends with Interlude / Get On Down Home, a track that I've sometimes seen subdivided, but, you know, the CD I have, it's not subdivided, so we're gonna do it as one. Interlude is this really cool bagpipe and vocal-driven, well, interlude. It's very majestic, the bagpipes are incorporated very well, I like the vocals a lot, and I like the way it transitions into Get On Down Home, a piece explicitly inspired by Led Zeppelin, which to me winds up sounding almost a little bit like 1975 era 10cc doing Led Zeppelin, specifically something in those guitars. There's a lengthy drum solo towards the end that I believe was explicitly said to be inspired in large part by John Bonham's playing on the classic Led Zeppelin track Moby Dick from 1969, and the song eventually returns to its more hard-rocking original state and plays the album out in a truly idiosyncratic Roy Wood fashion. Mustard is, of course, a very good album, as indicated by the glowing track reviews that I have given throughout this video that I should have finished 3 weeks ago. However, there is one thing that I forgot when I was working on this video 3 weeks ago, And that is, of course, the singles, because something I ran out of time before I really got the opportunity to say is that one of the things that makes Roy Wood interesting to me is that in many respects he sort of unites the two disparate camps of people who like 60s and 70s music from the UK. You have people like myself who are all about albums and, 12-inch, 33.5 RPM vinyl records and or CDs. And then you have a second group of people. I'm friends with a lot of these people. In fact, I think both of the people who inspired me to do this project, one of whom by depositing $7 in my Patreon, are this type of person. And this person has, they have a 45 collection. They have every chart hit from 1964 to 1999, or even, in fact, perhaps 2007, or whenever it was that the UK charts stopped being good, which they may or may not have ever stopped being good. I don't know. I don't follow them. And they can tell you that in April of 1974, Colonel Rodney Skellington and his Shather Raggy Bum Committee hit number 2 with their hit Put a Locomotive in Your Marmite Jar. Two different crowds. Roy Wood contains multitudes. He's got something for everybody. And as such, Roy Wood is one of the only people who was active in the 60s I can think of who continued to do the albums and singles are completely different from each other. You can listen to one and never be aware of the other thing throughout the 70s, and this album is no exception to that. Fortunately, the recent re-release, which liner notes to which may or may not have plagiarized my mate Lee's Wikipedia article, helpfully includes all of the unique tracks that were not included on the album. The first of which, Oh What a Shame, is a very good song. The best way I know how to describe this is What If the Beach Boys Really Rocked. It's really good, classic mid-70s glam fare, and I'm surprised it didn't do any better than it did. Its B-side, Bengal Jig, is a lively Indian-inflected tune. I don't know enough about dance forms to know if this is actually a jig, but it's very good and I enjoy the bagpipes. Next we have Rattlesnake Roll, a very good track. Overproduced 50s rock pastiche. It's great stuff. Reminds me a lot of a more elaborate and involved version of the kind of stuff that's on the second Wizard album. I don't like it quite as much as Oh What a Shame, but it's definitely a very strong track. The B-side, Can't Help My Feelings, is a much more standard hard rockin' 70s type thing. It's very good, a little bit overproduced as well. When I say overproduced, I mean it in a positive way. Though I probably should just say very, very, very involved production. Anyway, next up in singles or addendums to the album, we have Strider, a fun sort of jazzy, proggy, very Roy Wood instrumental. If I had to describe this to somebody who had never heard Roy Wood before, I would say it sounds like ELO in their more adventurous moments mixed with the instrumental stuff on some of the later Godly and Cream 10cc albums, which I say, and then I realize I believe there's only actually one instrumental Godly and Cream 10cc song, so that's my way of saying it sounds like the title track of How Dare You. Anyway, we're moving on. Indiana Rainbow, the A-side of the last two tracks I'm talking about in this review, is a really good song as well. It reminds me simultaneously of 50s torch songs and also sort of Latin-y deep cuts that British invasion groups used to like to do in the early to mid-60s. But again, as I've been saying, very strongly produced. There's some great flutes in here, or things that sound like flutes that people are going to yell at me for not knowing aren't flutes. And some really cool guitar towards the end of the track. It reminds me just a little bit of Asia and Royal Scam era Steely Dan, but again, these are lazy comparisons that I throw in because Roy Wood is very singular, but he's also very foreign to me because I'm not as hardcore of a Roy Wood fan as I think many of the people watching this video will be. So remember that when you tell me to do unmentionable things in the comments. The thing is this is The Thing is the last track I'm talking about in this album. I'm moving my hands like this. I do not know why. It is something I'm doing right now. It reminds me just a little bit of contemporary Utopia and Frank Zappa's instrumental stuff from around this period, but that's only the middle part of the song. The opening and closing, well, I'll put it to you this way. If you put it in mono and told me this was a lost 50s jazz side cut by one of the less known, but not one of the less high-quality jazz groups of the period, I might believe you. But, as I said in the middle, it gets very proggy, very 1975, connecting a little bit to Superactive Wizzo Band and also the unreleased Third Wizard album that languished in obscurity until I think around the year 2000, and it was finally released sometime around that time with an abominable cover. That's a tangent for another day. It's a great track. As I was saying before I so rudely interrupted myself, Mustard is a very, very strong album. In some respects, maybe the crowning jewel of solo Roy Wood. Certainly one of the most involved and impressive albums of the 1970s, and a shining example of the type of studio as instrument record that I find endlessly fascinating. I don't know if it's actually my favorite Roy Wood album. I find his work very hard to rate because it is so eclectic. I don't quite know if I would call it my favorite Roy Wood album. I like Boulders a lot, and The Move have several albums that, depending on the day, I might put slightly above this one. But it's top three. There's no question about that. It's definitely top three. It's a very impressive record. You know, Roy Wood is somebody where it can be hard to really grab onto. The Roy Wood thing, although it is one thing, is also like 5 different other things. And some of them are things that, you know, most of us are not accustomed to being thrown together on one record. And while I think this album is probably a little bit more successful in being a coherent thing than some of his other projects, I can't quite be sure that this would be the right record for you to hear if you've never listened to Roy Wood before. However, once you've heard at least a couple Move albums and Boulders, definitely give this one a try. It's many people's favorite album of his, and it's definitely up there for me. I rate it 8.5 pitched up Andrews Sisters out of 10, and I strongly advise you to listen to it today. Until next time, I hope you all have a nice day, and the next video, hopefully, will not take over a month. Hopefully. Anyway, bye.